The Galactic Council chamber floated in the empty space between stars like a giant crystal ball that reflected the light of distant suns, and inside this magnificent structure sat the representatives of 10,000 different alien species who had lived together in peace for many centuries without any major wars or conflicts to disturb their quiet existence. Ambassador Kelthris stood before the assembled crowd, and his body was made of living crystal that caught the blue light and scattered it in rainbow patterns across the polished floor, and he raised one of his 4 arms to get everyone's attention, because he had something important to say that would change everything they knew about the universe and their place in it. The humans have been silent for 300 years now, and their borders remain closed to all visitors, and their worlds emit no signals of any kind. And I believe it is time we sent someone to investigate what happened to them, because we cannot simply ignore an entire species that has gone dark for so long without knowing if they are alive or dead or something else entirely. Counselor Vraxt was a tall insect creature whose body was covered in hard black armor, and his large compound eyes reflected the concerned faces of everyone in the chamber, and he clicked his sharp mandibles together in a way that showed he was worried about what Kelthris was suggesting, because the old records contained warnings about disturbing the humans during their long sleep. The Treaty of Earth's Rest was signed for very good reasons that our ancestors understood better than we do, and those reasons had to do with things the humans could do in war that frightened every other species in the galaxy into agreeing that it was better to let them sleep than to risk waking them up before they were ready to face the universe again. Kelthris waved his crystalline hand in a dismissive gesture that showed he thought such concerns were nothing more than old superstitions based on exaggerated stories from a time long past, and he argued that the humans had been formidable warriors. Yes, but 300 years of silence meant they had either died out completely or evolved into something peaceful that no longer cared about the material universe at all. Either way, we must know the truth, because ignorance serves no one and knowledge is always better than fear. And besides, what harm could come from simply looking at their worlds from a safe distance to see if anyone is still home, and if they are, we can try to establish contact in a peaceful way that respects their privacy. The vote was held, and the majority agreed with Kelthris that an expedition should be sent to human space to discover what had happened to this mysterious species that had once been part of the galactic community, but had withdrawn so completely that it was as if they had never existed at all except in the old history files. Captain Zorvak was chosen to command the exploration vessel called Luminous Dawn, because he was known for his careful nature and diplomatic skills, and with him traveled the scientist Mira Quellen, who was an expert in studying dead civilizations, and Braxis, the security chief whose job was to protect everyone if things went wrong in unexpected ways. The ship crossed into the quarantine zone that surrounded human territory, and immediately Mira began staring at her instruments with growing confusion written all over her face, because the readings she was getting made no sense according to everything she knew about abandoned space and dead civilizations. Captain, I am detecting energy signatures throughout this entire region, but they are so faint and so perfectly distributed that our sensors initially classified them as nothing more than background radiation from the stars themselves. But now that I look closer, I can see they form patterns that could only be artificial in origin. Zorvak leaned forward in his command chair and asked what kind of energy signatures she was talking about, because the distinction mattered greatly if they were going to understand what they were dealing with in human space, and whether it was safe to continue, or if they should turn back immediately. Quantum surveillance networks, and there are millions of them scattered through space like invisible eyes watching everything that happens within 50 light years of the human border. And Captain, these networks are still active and maintained by something or someone, which means the humans did not simply die out or disappear into nothingness. Braxis checked all his weapon systems and made sure the shields were operating at full power, because if the humans could see the luminous dawn, then they had already made a choice about whether to respond or remain silent, and that choice would tell them everything they needed to know about human intentions toward unexpected visitors. They pressed deeper into human space, following the old navigation data to a system that had once been called New Haven, according to the records, and when they emerged from faster-than-light travel, they found themselves looking at a world that took their breath away with its impossible beauty. The planet below was covered in sprawling cities that stretched across entire continents, but the cities were completely empty, with no people walking the streets and no vehicles moving along the roads, and yet all the lights were still burning, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment and would return at any second. Orbital stations hung in space above the planet, and their lights glowed with steady power, but there were no life signs coming from them, and no communication signals being broadcast, and nothing that suggested anyone was home, except for the fact that everything was still working perfectly after 300 years. It looks like they simply vanished into thin air, leaving everything behind in perfect working order. And I cannot explain how that is possible, because even the most advanced automated systems should have failed by now, without regular maintenance. And yet everything is still functioning as if it were brand new. But Zorvac noticed something else that made his blood run cold in his veins, and he pointed at the tactical display where hundreds of weapons platforms appeared as red dots surrounding the planet in a defensive sphere that could destroy anything that came too close. Those stations are moving and adjusting their positions to track our ship and look at the planetary defenses, because they are all active and powered up, and every single weapon is pointed directly at us right now, which means we are either in terrible danger or being tested to see what we will do next. Braxis spoke in a quiet voice that barely rose above a whisper, and he said they should leave immediately because this was either a trap designed to capture foolish explorers, or a tomb guarded by machines that would kill anyone who disturbed the dead, and either way staying here was a very bad idea. Before Zorvac could give the order to retreat, a message appeared on every screen in the ship, and the text was written in perfect galactic standard, which meant the humans, or their machines, had been listening to galactic communications for centuries, and learning languages while everyone thought they were gone forever. Turn back. And this is your only warning, because you have crossed into space that belongs to humanity, and we do not welcome visitors at this time, and if you value your lives, you will leave now, and never return to this place again. There was no signature on the message and no indication of where it had come from, and the message simply existed in their computer systems, as if it had always been there, waiting to be read. And that impossibility frightened Zorvac more than any threat could have done. Helm set a course back to galactic space and engage maximum speed because we are leaving right now, and we will not slow down until we are safely across the border and far away from whatever is watching us from the shadows of these empty cities. As the luminous dawn fled back toward safety, Mira continued monitoring her sensors, and what she discovered in those final moments would haunt her dreams for years to come, because deep underground on every human world her instruments detected massive caverns that had been sealed with technology beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. Capped in these caverns are enormous, and each one could house billions of people, and the power readings coming from them are unlike anything in my database because they are generating enough energy to run an entire civilization underground where no one can see them from space. How massive are we talking about here, because I need to know the scale of what we are dealing with, if I am going to explain this to the Council when we return. Mira's voice shook as she answered, and she said each cavern was large enough to contain the entire population of a major world, and the humans had built hundreds of these shelters across dozens of planets, which meant billions or even trillions of humans were sleeping in the darkness waiting for something. They are not extinct, and they did not evolve beyond physical form, and they did not leave this galaxy for another dimension or reality, and instead, they simply chose to go to sleep, and they left their machines behind to guard the borders and maintain their cities and watch for threats or visitors who might disturb their rest. The ship crossed back into galactic space, and every member of the crew felt relief wash over them like cool water on a hot day, but that relief was mixed with a new fear, because they had discovered something the galaxy needed to know but did not want to believe. Humanity had not fallen, and they had not abandoned the universe, and they had not transcended into pure energy or consciousness, and instead, they had made a choice that no other species had ever made in the history of the galaxy. They had chosen to sleep and leave the waking world behind, and the question that haunted. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session after the luminous dawn returned, with news that shook every delegate to their core, and Ambassador Kelthris stood before them, looking much less confident than he had when he first proposed the expedition to human space, because what they found was far more disturbing than an extinct species. We must access the restricted archives immediately, because we need to understand the true history of humanity and their wars, and why our ancestors agreed to let them sleep for as long as they wished without interference. And I believe the answers we seek are locked away in files that were sealed centuries ago for reasons that seemed wise at the time. The motion passed without a single voice of opposition, because everyone in the chamber understood that ignorance was no longer an option, and they needed to know what kind of beings were sleeping in those underground caverns, and what it would take to either wake them or ensure they stayed asleep forever. Historian Davin Clark was summoned to the council chambers, and he was one of the few humans who had chosen to remain in galactic space when his people retreated to their core worlds 3 centuries ago, and his ancestors had kept the stories alive even when the council wanted those stories forgotten and buried. My people remembered everything that happened during the HFY War, and we passed down the accounts from generation to generation, because we believed the galaxy needed to remember what humanity was capable of when pushed beyond the limits of patience and mercy. He activated the ancient data cores that had been sealed since the Treaty of Earth's Rest was signed, and holographic displays filled the chamber with images of a war that most species had tried to forget because the memories were too painful and the lessons too harsh for comfortable contemplation. 500 years ago, a species called the Vrex Dominion emerged from the southern edge of the galaxy, and they were conquerors who believed that strength gave them the right to rule over all other species, and they swept through system after system, enslaving or exterminating everyone they encountered. The young Galactic Council, which had only existed for about a century at that point, tried to organize a defense, but the member species could not agree on strategy or leadership, and the coalition fell apart under the pressure of Rex attacks that targeted the weakest species first. Humanity had only recently joined the galactic community, and they were still exploring their place among the stars, and they sent diplomatic missions to the Vrex, hoping to negotiate peace, or at least establish some kind of understanding that would prevent unnecessary bloodshed. The Vrex response was to capture the human diplomats and broadcast their torture and execution across every communication channel in the galaxy, as a message to all species that resistance was futile and submission was the only path to survival. What happened next is why humanity should never be disturbed during their long sleep. Because the humans did not respond with angry words or economic sanctions or diplomatic protests, and instead they mobilized for total war with a speed that shocked every observer. Commander Jake Morrison led the first human fleet at the Battle of Kelvar's Edge, and his flagship was a massive vessel called the Vengeance that dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly inside the VREX defensive perimeter in a maneuver that should have torn the ship apart from the gravitational stresses alone. They calculated the jump coordinates to within a micron of accuracy, while inside a gravity well, and that level of precision was considered impossible by every physicist in the galaxy. But the humans did it anyway because they understood mathematics and physics in ways that other species did not. The Vengeance opened fire with weapons that the galaxy had never seen before, including relativistic kinetic rounds that struck with the force of nuclear explosions and antimatter torpedoes that erased entire Vrex battle groups from existence, and quantum decoherence warheads that disrupted matter at the subatomic level. The human fleet engaged a Vrex armada that outnumbered them 30-1, and the battle should have been a massacre of the humans. But instead, it became a demonstration of what happened when a species truly understood warfare as both science and art. Human ships moved through space with coordination so perfect that they seemed to share a single mind, and weapons fire threaded through impossible angles to strike weak points that should not have been targetable from those positions, and every movement was calculated to maximize damage while minimizing risk. The battle lasted only 4 hours, and when it ended, the Vrex armada was nothing but debris floating in space, and the human fleet had lost exactly 3 ships out of their entire force, and those losses were mourned by every human who heard the news. But the Vrex made a terrible mistake because they believed they could break human resolve through terror, and they sent retribution fleets to attack human colony worlds where civilians lived in peace, and they killed millions of innocent people thinking it would force humanity to surrender. They were catastrophically wrong in their assessment because humanity did not break under the weight of grief, and instead they transformed their sorrow into something cold and precise and utterly devastating. Colonel Lisa Grant led the human response, and what followed was not a war in the traditional sense, but rather a systematic dismantling of everything the Vrex had built over the course of a century. Human fleets appeared simultaneously across 30 Vrex systems without warning or declaration or negotiation, and they simply began destroying every military installation and industrial facility and orbital platform that supported the Vrex war machine. They did not occupy the conquered worlds, and they did not enslave the Vrex population, and they did not even demand surrender, because their purpose was not conquest, but rather a lesson that would be remembered for all time. The campaign lasted 3 months, and by the end of it the Vrex Dominion, which had taken 100 years to build, had ceased to exist as a political entity, and the surviving Vrex fled to the Galactic Rim as broken refugees who would never threaten another species again. The final message from General Peter Hayes, who commanded all human forces, was broadcast across the galaxy, and it said that humanity had come to the stars seeking peace and friendship, but the Vrex had chosen violence, and this was mercy, because the humans had allowed them to keep their lives. Next time there would be nothing left, and every species in the galaxy understood that this was not an idle threat, but a promise that would be kept without hesitation or remorse if anyone made the same mistake the Vrex had made. But what frightened the Galactic Council most was not the military capability humanity had demonstrated, but rather what happened after the war ended, because the humans held a great conference where they debated whether they had become monsters. The psychological trauma to human society was profound because they had discovered they were exceptionally good at warfare, and this knowledge horrified them in ways that other species could not understand, because most species accepted violence as a natural part of existence. Humans protested against their own military, and artists created monuments to the Vrex civilians who died in the crossfire, and philosophers questioned whether the victory had cost humanity its soul, and religious leaders held ceremonies of mourning for both human and alien dead. They wept for their enemies, and this behavior made no sense to the other species who believed that victory should be celebrated without guilt or regret. But humans seemed to carry the weight of every death on their collective conscience. Then humanity made a choice that shocked the galaxy even more than their military prowess had done, because they announced they would seal their borders and retreat from galactic affairs until they had processed what they had become and what it meant for their future. They told the Council they needed time to understand the darkness they had discovered within themselves, and they would sleep until the galaxy no longer needed warriors, or until some threat so terrible emerged that only humanity could stop it. The Council agreed immediately because they were terrified that humanity might decide the Council itself was a threat that needed to be eliminated, and better to have the humans sleeping peacefully than active and potentially dangerous. The Treaty of Earth's Rest guaranteed human isolation in exchange for humanity's promise to answer if the galaxy faced existential danger that could not be handled by conventional means. But the defenses around human space were not designed to keep other species out, according to Davin, and instead they were built to ensure that if humanity ever woke up, it would be for the right reasons and not because of some accident or misunderstanding. Every human world is monitored by artificial intelligences programmed with one directive, and that directive is to assess whether the galaxy truly needs humanity's capacity for violence or whether the current situation can be resolved through other means. Those machines are not just watching us, but they are also judging us and deciding whether we are worthy of disturbing their creators, and that is why they sent us away, because our curiosity was not a valid reason to wake billions of sleeping warriors. The chamber fell silent as every delegate absorbed the implications of what they had learned, and finally someone asked the question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. What would it take for those machines to decide the galaxy needs humanity to wake up? And Davin's answer was simple and terrifying in its honesty. Pray we never find out. 60 years passed after the Luminous Dawn expedition, and the incident became a story that parents told their children to teach them about respecting boundaries and understanding that some things were better left undisturbed, and the human borders remained untouched while the Galactic Council grew stronger and more prosperous with each passing year. New species joined the Council, and trade routes expanded across the galaxy, and conflicts were resolved through negotiation rather than warfare, and it seemed that perhaps the galaxy had finally learned the lessons that humanity had tried to teach, through their withdrawal from active participation in galactic affairs. Then the harvesters arrived from beyond the galactic rim, and they came without warning or communication, and they were unlike anything the galaxy had ever encountered before, because they did not seek territory or resources in the traditional sense, but rather, they consumed everything in their path. They were crystalline vessels that moved through space like a swarm of locusts, and they stripped entire worlds down to bedrock and converted the raw materials into more harvester ships, and the swarm grew exponentially with each world they consumed, and nothing seemed capable of stopping their advance. Commander Elena Brooks was assigned to defend the Earthani homeworld when the Harvesters arrived in the system, and she commanded a fleet of 200 Council warships that represented the combined military might of a dozen different species working together. All ships move into defensive formation beta and target the smaller vessels because maybe we can slow them down enough for the evacuation to be completed and buy time for reinforcements to arrive from the core systems. Her fleet faced a Harvester swarm that numbered over 10,000 ships, and the battle was hopeless from the very beginning because Council weapons barely scratched the crystalline hulls, and the Harvesters seemed to absorb energy weapons and shrug off kinetic rounds as if they were nothing more than mild annoyances. Within an hour, half of Elena's fleet was destroyed, and the survivors were running low on ammunition and power and morale, and she knew they could not hold much longer against an enemy that seemed immune to everything they threw at it. Fall back to planetary orbit and we will make our final stand there, because I will not abandon the people below to die without someone trying to protect them, even if that protection is ultimately futile. She received a priority transmission from the Galactic Council, ordering her to disengage immediately and retreat to a safe distance because the evacuation of the Earthani homeworld was underway, and her sacrifice would serve no purpose if the Harvesters destroyed her fleet before the civilian ships could escape. Negative Council, because if we leave now, the Harvesters will destroy the evacuation ships before they can jump to light speed, and I will not let that happen while I still have ships that can fight and crews willing to die for something that matters. Elena cut the transmission and looked at her tactical officer, Lieutenant Ryan Cole, who was monitoring the Harvester advance with growing concern, because the crystalline ships were reorganizing into a formation that suggested they were preparing for a final, overwhelming assault. How long can we hold this position? And Ryan checked his displays and ran calculations, and his answer was not encouraging, because they had maybe 20 minutes of fighting capability left before their ammunition was exhausted and their shields failed completely. Then we give them 30 minutes because those evacuation ships need every second we can buy. And I do not care if it is impossible, because impossible is just a word that means we have not tried hard enough yet. But something strange happened that no one could explain, because the Harvester swarm suddenly stopped advancing, and every crystalline ship froze in space, as if listening to something that the Council forces could not hear or detect with their instruments. What are they doing? And Ryan had no answer, because the Harvesters had never exhibited this kind of behavior before, and they had certainly never stopped an attack in the middle of a battle when victory was within their grasp. Then the Harvesters turned as one and began accelerating away from the Earthani homeworld. And they were not retreating in disorder, but rather moving with purpose toward a specific destination. And that destination made Elena's blood run cold when she realized what it was. They are heading toward human space, and Ryan spoke the words that everyone on the bridge was thinking, but no one wanted to say aloud. They are running away from something, and the only thing in that direction is the human quarantine zone, which means either the Harvesters know something we don't, or they just made the worst mistake in their entire existence. 3 minutes later, the answer came when the quantum surveillance network that had watched silently for centuries suddenly activated and broadcast a message across every communication channel in the galaxy. Attention all Galactic Council forces. Because the Awakening Protocol has been initiated, and humanity has assessed the current threat level and determined that intervention is warranted, and we are mobilizing to engage the Harvester swarm, and all Council forces are ordered to evacuate the following sectors immediately. A star map appeared showing massive regions of space marked in red, and those regions formed a corridor leading directly from human space to the area where the Harvesters were concentrated, and Elena understood immediately what was about to happen. They are not coming to help us defend our worlds, and instead they are going to fight through everything between them and the Harvesters, and they want us out of the way so we do not get caught in the crossfire. Ryan stared at the map and calculated the implications, and he realized that the humans were not planning a defensive action, but rather an offensive strike that would take them deep into Harvester-controlled territory. Across the galaxy, the message repeated, and Council forces scrambled to comply, because no one wanted to be in the path of an awakened humanity, and civilian populations fled in panic from worlds that had been peaceful for generations, but now sat in the projected combat zone. On every human world deep beneath the surface, the seals on the massive caverns began to open for the first time in 3 centuries, and what emerged was an entire civilization that had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. Dr. Nathan Price was studying the quantum surveillance network from a research station at a safe distance when his instruments detected massive power surges across all human core worlds, and he ordered his team to focus every camera and sensor they had on the nearest human city. What they witnessed was impossible to fully comprehend because streets that had been empty for 300 years suddenly filled with millions of people moving with calm efficiency and purpose, and there was no confusion or chaos or disorder of any kind. They know exactly what is happening, and one of Nathan's assistants observed that the humans were not acting like people who had just woken from centuries of sleep, but rather like soldiers who had been waiting for deployment orders. Because they never fully slept in the traditional sense, and Nathan realized the truth as he watched the organized mobilization, and instead, they have been in some kind of suspended animation that kept them aware of everything happening in the galaxy while their bodies rested. The human fleets launched within hours, and ships that had hung dormant in orbital yards for 3 centuries activated their systems and formed into battle groups, and these were not the ships that had fought the Vrex War because those had been dismantled long ago. These were new vessels built during the long sleep and designed with 3 centuries of theoretical warfare in mind, and they incorporated technology that the Council had never seen, and weapons that operated on principles that seemed to violate known physics. Admiral Victoria Stone commanded the lead fleet from her flagship called the Silent Thunder, and her first transmission to the Galactic Council was brief and left no room for negotiation or debate. By authority of the ancient treaty between humanity and the Galactic Council, we are assuming tactical command of all defensive operations against the Harvester threat, and Council forces will provide support and evacuation assistance as directed, and do not under any circumstances attempt to interfere with human combat operations, or you will be treated as hostile. It was not a request or a suggestion, but rather a statement of fact, delivered with absolute confidence, and the Galactic Council, which had grown comfortable in their role as the galaxy's leadership, suddenly found themselves subordinate to a species that had been sleeping while they built their civilization. Captain Zorvac, who had led the original expedition to human space 60 years ago, was now an admiral commanding a Council defense fleet, and he watched the human armada pass through his sector on their way to intercept the Harvesters. They are not conducting reconnaissance or gathering intelligence or testing the enemy's defenses, and instead, they are heading straight for direct confrontation, as if they already know everything they need to know about the Harvesters. Mira Quellen, who had continued her studies of human culture over the decades, explained what Zorvac was witnessing, and her words carried the weight of years spent trying to understand a species that defied conventional analysis. The quantum surveillance network has been feeding them data about the Harvesters since the moment they entered our galaxy, and humanity has spent that entire time analyzing the enemy and calculating strategies and running simulations, and they already know how to defeat. The first engagement between humanity and the Harvesters happened in a region of space called the Kalem Expanse, where dense asteroid fields and gravitational anomalies made navigation dangerous for most species, but Admiral Victoria Stone had chosen this battlefield with careful deliberation, because the terrain favored the tactics she planned to employ. All ships execute pattern Omega on my mark, and she spoke calmly into the communication system, as if she were ordering lunch rather than commanding 2,000 warships into battle against an enemy that had destroyed 30 civilizations. The human fleet spread out across the expanse in a formation that seemed random to outside observers, but was actually precisely calculated, and the Harvester swarm approached with 50,000 ships moving in their typical overwhelming mass formation that had crushed every defense the galaxy could mount. Mark and Victoria gave the order, and the human ships vanished from every sensor and detection system the Harvesters possessed. And it was not faster than light travel, but rather quantum stealth technology that made the ships indistinguishable from empty space itself. The Harvester swarm suddenly found themselves facing nothing, and their crystalline intelligence tried to process this impossibility, because their sensors showed the human fleet had simply ceased to exist, and they began their standard search pattern, which was exactly what Victoria had predicted. Fire and the word came quietly, But the result was anything but quiet because from seemingly empty space came weapons fire of such devastating power that entire clusters of harvester ships simply disintegrated under the assault. The humans had positioned their vessels inside the asteroids themselves using the gravitational anomalies to mask their presence, and now they fired at point-blank range with weapons that operated on principles the harvesters had never encountered in millions of years of conquest. Quantum disruption cannons tore apart crystalline hulls at the molecular level, and gravity lance projectors created microscopic black holes that consumed harvester vessels from the inside out. And there were other weapons that seemed to rewrite the laws of physics in localized areas of space. Captain Danny Foster commanded a destroyer called the Relentless, and his ship materialized inside a cluster of harvester vessels and fired a full spread of antimatter torpedoes at zero range, and then phased back into quantum stealth before the explosions could reach his position. Clean Hit and his tactical officer, Lieutenant Karen Mills, reported that 17 harvester ships had been destroyed without the Relentless taking any damage, and Danny ordered her to find the next target cluster because they would keep hitting the harvesters until the enemy learned fear. But the harvesters did not understand fear because they were a collective intelligence that had never encountered failure, and they adapted quickly by deploying countermeasures and flooding the battlefield with sensor pulses across every possible spectrum, trying to force the human ships to reveal themselves. Victoria watched the tactical display and smiled because the harvesters had taken the bait exactly as her models predicted, and she ordered all ships to drop their stealth fields and surge forward in what appeared to be a desperate frontal assault. The harvesters concentrated their forces to meet this attack because their intelligence calculated that the humans had been forced out of hiding and now could be destroyed through superior numbers and overwhelming firepower. It was exactly what Victoria wanted because concentrated enemies were easier to kill, and she gave the order to Commander Helen Carter, who commanded a science vessel called the Archimedes. Initiating gravity well collapse in 3, 2, 1, and Helen activated a device that humanity had spent decades developing, and it was a gravity manipulation platform that could temporarily destabilize the natural gravitational fields in a region of space. The asteroid field, which had been relatively stable, suddenly became a chaotic storm of spinning rock and distorted space-time, and the harvester swarm caught in the middle found themselves battered by asteroids moving at speeds that would crack planets. All ships synchronized volley, and Victoria commanded 2,000 human warships to fire as one. But they did not aim at the harvesters, and instead they targeted specific points in the destabilized gravity field, creating a cascade effect that amplified the chaos into something truly devastating. When the gravitational storm subsided, 30,000 harvester vessels had been reduced to glittering fragments of crystal floating in space, and the remaining 20,000 ships retreated for the first time in their existence because their collective intelligence recognized it had encountered something unprecedented. Victoria ordered pursuit because she would not allow the harvesters to regroup, and across the galaxy other human battle groups were achieving similar victories, using tactics that combined superior technology with centuries of theoretical warfare, refined during the long sleep. General Marcus Webb commanded all human operations from the world of Unity, and his role was coordination, because every human fleet needed to act as part of a greater strategy that would end the harvester threat permanently. Admiral Stone has secured the Calum Expanse, and Admiral Chris Moore is engaging harvester forces near the Vale Nebula, and Admiral Nancy Wright is requesting permission to pursue fleeing harvester ships into their controlled territory. Denied, and Marcus gave the order without hesitation because he wanted the harvesters to run back to their source, and Nancy would hold position and let the enemy think they were escaping to safety. The Council is requesting an update on our strategy, and an aide informed Marcus that the galactic leadership wanted to understand what humanity was trying to accomplish, because human tactics seemed incomprehensible to species that had never embraced total warfare. Tell them we are implementing containment, and Marcus decided to share part of the plan because the Council deserved to know that humanity was not simply destroying harvester ships at random, but rather executing a carefully designed strategy. We are not trying to destroy every harvester vessel in the galaxy, and instead we are herding them toward a specific location, and once they are concentrated, we will end this threat in a single decisive strike. The aide understood immediately because If the harvesters were being driven rather than destroyed, it meant humanity had identified a critical vulnerability and was maneuvering the enemy into position to exploit that weakness. You are planning to decapitate their command structure. And Marcus nodded because the humans had been analyzing harvester communications since they entered the galaxy and discovered that every ship was controlled by a central hive consciousness located in a single star system. Precisely. And once we destroy that central intelligence, the entire harvester swarm becomes nothing more than mindless vessels drifting in space, and the threat ends permanently without having to hunt down every individual ship. It was ruthless and efficient and exactly what humanity excelled at, because they understood that warfare was ultimately about achieving objectives with minimum waste and maximum effect. Across the human fleet, soldiers and crew members performed their duties with determination that came from knowing why they fought, and Private Kevin James stood watch aboard the Silent Thunder, even though no harvester had ever attempted to board a human vessel. First Combat and his squad leader, Sergeant Linda Turner, noticed his tension and asked if he was handling the stress, because young soldiers often struggled with the reality of warfare versus the theory they learned in training. I trained my entire life for this, but I never thought it would actually happen. And Kevin admitted his fear because among humans, honesty about emotions was considered strength rather than weakness. None of us wanted this, but that is why we are here. And Linda explained the philosophy that guided humanity through the darkness of necessary violence, and we fight so species like the Earthani never have to become what we are. Do you think we will sleep again when this is over? And Kevin asked the question that weighed on everyone's mind because returning to the long rest meant accepting that the galaxy still needed warriors kept in reserve. I hope so, because if we do not return to sleep, it means the galaxy has decided it needs permanent soldiers, and that would be the saddest outcome imaginable. The human fleets continued their calculated pursuit and drove the harvester forces exactly where Marcus wanted them, and every engagement was measured and every victory was deliberate, and the humans fought not in rage but in cold mathematical precision. How long until we are in position? And Marcus asked his tactical officer, who was monitoring the movement of all harvester forces across multiple star systems. 72 hours, and the answer came with certainty, because human coordination allowed them to predict enemy movements with accuracy that seemed like precognition to outside observers. Then in 72 hours we end this war, and Marcus opened a communication channel to all human forces and reminded them why they fought and what they represented. You have fought brilliantly and honored the trust placed in us when the galaxy agreed to let us sleep, and soon we face the final battle, and after that we return home and resume our rest and leave behind a galaxy that understands why disturbing our sleep should be avoided. Admiral Victoria Stone added her own message to her fleet, and her words reflected the core belief that guided humanity through the moral complexity of wielding such devastating power. We are not conquerors, and we are not. The harvester hive world, called Nexus Prime, hung in space like a massive crystalline heart, pulsing with the collected consciousness of billions of individual vessels, and around it the remnants of the harvester swarm clustered in defensive formations, with over 100,000 ships preparing for humanity's final assault. They believed they were ready because they had fought for millions of years and consumed entire civilizations. But they had never faced an enemy that understood war as both science and philosophy, and that ignorance would prove fatal. Admiral Victoria Stone stood on the bridge of the Silent Thunder studying the tactical display, with the calm expression of someone who had already seen the outcome in her mind. And around her the human fleet maintained quantum stealth while they positioned themselves for the killing blow. All battle groups report ready, and Commander Helen Carter announced that every ship was in position and every weapon was charged, and every crew member understood their role in what was about to happen. Commence Operation Final Silence, and Victoria gave the order that would end the harvester threat forever, and the attack began not with violence but with something far more insidious. 30 human cyber warfare vessels led by Captain Alan Brooks aboard the Phantom launched a coordinated assault on the harvester communication network, but this was not a conventional computer hack, because humanity had spent 3 centuries studying consciousness itself, deploying consciousness fragmentation algorithm. And Alan reported as his hands moved across holographic controls. and the weapon humanity unleashed was designed to attack the fundamental structure of networked intelligence by introducing logical paradoxes that forced the hive to divide its attention. The algorithm spread through the Harvester network like poison, and the collective consciousness that had controlled billions of ships with perfect coordination suddenly found itself struggling to process contradictions that had no resolution, and the effect rippled across every vessel. They are confused, and Alan observed as the Harvester defensive formations wavered, because the central intelligence could no longer maintain perfect control and estimate 30 seconds before they adapt to the attack. "That is all we need," and Victoria said calmly, and then gave the order that every human captain had been waiting to hear since the moment they woke from their long sleep. All ships drop stealth and commence full assault, and the human fleet materialized around Nexus Prime like an iron fist closing around a fragile crystal, and 300 warships each carrying enough firepower to devastate planets opened fire simultaneously. The Harvesters attempted to respond, but their coordination was shattered by the consciousness fragmentation, and individual vessels fired at random targets without the precision that had made them so deadly, and human ships weaved through the chaos with reflexes that seemed superhuman. Lieutenant Karen Mills piloted the destroyer Relentless through a cluster of Harvester vessels, and her fingers danced across controls with practiced grace, while Captain Danny Foster beside her coordinated weapons fire with surgical precision. "Target the support structures around Nexus Prime," and Danny ordered because they needed to isolate the central hive from the defensive fleet and sever the physical connections that reinforced the collective consciousness. Missiles streaked from the Relentless, and each one was guided by quantum-entangled navigation systems that made jamming impossible, and they struck the massive crystalline tendrils connecting the hive world to its fleet and severed the links one by one. Admiral Chris Moore commanded heavy battleships in the second wave, and his fleet was designed for overwhelming firepower rather than speed or stealth, and when he gave the order to fire, the result was devastating. All ships focus on the hive's northern hemisphere and gravity lances at full power, and the battleships unleashed weapons that created localized distortions in space-time itself, and the crystalline surface of Nexus Prime cracked under forces that could bend reality. But the Harvesters were adapting faster than human models predicted, and the hive intelligence, though fragmented, began to overcome the logical paradoxes and restore coordination to the defensive fleet, and Harvester ships regrouped with their deadly precision returning. They are recovering faster than projected, and Victoria saw the tactical shift immediately and made the decision to accelerate the final phase of the operation, even though it meant taking greater risks. All battle groups deploy the Omega devices, now, and the order went out to 20 specialized vessels hidden among the main fleet, and these ships carried humanity's ultimate weapon against the Harvester collective consciousness. The Omega devices were antimatter charges of unprecedented scale, and each one could generate an explosion visible from neighboring star systems. But destruction was not their primary purpose, because they were delivery systems for something far more dangerous. General Marcus Webb, coordinating from Unity, watched as the Omega devices approached the hive world on trajectories calculated to penetrate deep into the crystalline structure before detonation. Confirmed devices on trajectory and detonation in 60 seconds, and Marcus spoke calmly, even though the next minute would determine whether humanity's strategy succeeded or failed catastrophically. In the Galactic Council chambers, representatives from every species watched through quantum-linked observation systems, and they saw human precision and coordination and the absolute refusal to waste resources on unnecessary actions. They are not trying to destroy the hive world through brute force, and Ambassador Kelthris realized as he watched the Omega devices dive toward Nexus Prime. And instead, they are trying to kill the consciousness itself. The devices detonated inside the hive world, and antimatter explosions tore through crystalline structures. But the real weapon was a quantum virus designed specifically to target the Harvester collective intelligence and rewrite its fundamental logic. Dr. Nathan Price explained to the Council what humanity had created, and his voice carried both awe and horror at the implications of such a weapon. The virus does not destroy information, but rather rewrites the consciousness to understand concepts it never learned, and it is teaching the Harvesters about mortality and fear, and the understanding that they can cease to exist. Inside Nexus Prime, the hive consciousness experienced something unprecedented in its millions of years of existence, and for the first time it felt terror as the quantum virus forced it to contemplate its own ending. And in that moment of existential horror, the hive made a choice that shocked every observer because instead of fighting to the death, it chose survival over pride. Every harvester vessel across the entire galaxy suddenly ceased all hostile actions, and they did not retreat or regroup, but simply stopped moving as if waiting for something. "What are they doing?" and Admiral Victoria Stone asked as she watched. "The enemy fleet around Nexus Prime power down weapons and halt all offensive maneuvers." The answer came as a transmission not in language but in pure mathematical concepts that human computers translated into words. "We surrender, and we seek negotiation, and we wish to exist and continue." And the message repeated across every channel, and the mighty harvester swarm that had consumed civilizations was asking for mercy. General Marcus Webb made the decision that would define humanity's role in galactic history, and he gave the order that proved humans were not monsters despite their capacity for devastating violence. "Cease fire, and all human forces hold position," and the command went out instantly, and thousands of ships stopped their attacks even though victory through complete annihilation was within reach. Victoria opened a channel to Marcus because she needed confirmation before making the next move. "General, we have them, and we can end the harvester species completely by destroying Nexus Prime, and without the central consciousness, they become extinct." And Marcus understood the temptation but also understood why humanity must resist it. "I know, but that is precisely why we will not do it." And his voice carried the weight of moral certainty. And he addressed the harvester consciousness directly through the open channel. "You came to our galaxy as destroyers and consumed worlds and exterminated species and believed yourself unstoppable, but you were wrong. And humanity did not wake from our long sleep to become exterminators ourselves. And we offer one chance to leave this galaxy and return to wherever you came from. And if you ever return, there will be no negotiation and no mercy and no second chance." The harvester response came immediately because the hive consciousness now understood what fear meant and why survival was more important than pride. "Understood, and we depart, and we will not return, and we have learned," and the massive harvester fleet began moving not toward any target, but toward the galactic rim where they had first entered known space. Admiral Nancy Wright was assigned to escort the harvesters out of the galaxy and ensure they actually left rather than hiding somewhere to rebuild, and she sent a message acknowledging the mission could take months. "I will make sure they leave, and this might take time, but I will see it through to completion." And Marcus replied that she should take all the time necessary, because humanity's credibility depended on following through completely. As the harvesters departed under escort, the human fleet began its withdrawal from the combat zones, and they did not celebrate or boast about their victory, but simply formed up and headed back toward their core worlds with quiet efficiency. Elena Brooks, The Counts,